Hey guys, Wolvie here and welcome back to the channel. As always, the usual disclaimer, any opinion here is mine and mine alone. Now, this is the long-awaited video on Bumblebee. For those of you in the RWBY community, this is the romantic pairing of Blake and Yang. Now, I do have to address a few things before I get into the premise of the video, and this is outside the opinion being mine and mine alone. First and foremost, I just got back from Target because I actually had to replace the tripod that I was using. And that is the results of something unexpected. I got a call related to work, even though I am still on paid time off until Monday when I go back. And as a result of the timing of the work-related call, it turns out that my tripod kind of stamped. I can no longer use it, so I had to make a quick run to Target in order to get a new tripod. Now I'm holding the tripod that I found at Target in a particular way. I do apologize. It is a bit of an it is what it is. So if some stuff comes up crooked like you see here, there's not much I can really do about it for the time being until I can get myself a completely different tripod. So this is something I will have to work with for the time being. Now, another thing here is that this video is several months in the making due to very real-life circumstances that delayed it for this long. Meaning that work-related, health stuff, travel, whatever have you, I had a lot of delays. And I want to make sure that when I get around to this video at long last, I don't have much else going on. But yeah, I did have to replace my tripod that I use with my phone because, again, I unexpectedly got a work-related call. And as a result of that call, it snapped my tripod despite the fact that I'm still on paid time off until I return to work on Monday. Regarding the premise of this video, it is in no particular order, as you can see on the screen. The facts tied to the relationship between Blake and Yang, yes, they're canon. Supporting and contradicting evidence. Is the community, regardless if it's they ship Bumblebee or not, is it hurting the ship? Is it really known if Yang is truly pansexual or not? I will get into this second question in number 4 later. Is there a rewrite in the works due to a lack of new info on Volume 10? And if there is a rewrite, will this affect Bumblebee if the rewrite is coming? Is the relationship left open-ended from a lack of new info on Volume 10? Is it one-sided probability-wise? Will it last? That's number 6. Number 7, does Bumblebee appear to be as planned from the start as his claims suggest? Yes, we've been hearing that it's been planned, but is it really planned due to certain evidence? Now, number 8 is my thoughts on the ship, and that comes at the very end. And it's going to be after I provide my personal experience with some of the Bumblebee shippers. Now, some side notes to take note of here. Now, the first side note is that when it comes to the evidence, there's going to be the contradicting and supporting evidence is going to be going back and forth throughout that section. So keep that in mind because I want this to be as complete of a picture of the evidence as possible to make this as unbiased as possible. Regarding Bumblebee and sense of the ship, all that jazz, the facts will come out before I state my opinion. Now, varying questions you see here is going to be opinionated replies, but there's going to be evidence to back it up. Now, pertaining to parts of number 4, it will not affect my opinions, but it will be used as supporting evidence. As this slide suggests, what is known about Bumblebee? What do we know about them in the sense of like becoming canon, so on and so forth? Now, some aspects of this, I will be revealing certain aspects of it a little bit later on. Now, the first thing we do need to know, hold on a second. So, becoming a couple, Blake and Yang become canon in Volume 9, Chapter 6. Now, bear in mind that Volume 9 is the last volume of RWBY to be aired and on any platform, meaning Crunchyroll. Now, there is a timed exclusivity for Crunchyroll instead of RWBY, and I say that because as of next year, 2024, Volume 9 will be on Rooster Teeth's website. Now, pertaining to Rooster Teeth, I will no longer be able to, do the free trial and buy into Volume 9 that way. I do have to go become a first member. That whole thing, that's a completely different video of its own in the sense of the changes of first membership, and it's not appropriate to do it here. So I will need to pay into it in order to do the Volume 9 revisited. Now, pertaining to the promotion and teasing, and I put teasing in quotation marks here, for Blake and Yang, this has been done, the promoting and teasing of Bumblebee, for some time. Now, I say this because there is a particular incident. I'm going to reveal that when I get to it. That does prove that it has been promoted, it has been teased, quote unquote, before they became canon. Now, another thing here is that there's a lot of he said, she said pertaining to the question of whether or not Bumblebee was truly planned from the start, because again, some people are saying it has been planned. Some people have said it has not. I'm going to get into both sides of that argument later on. Now, regarding some of the Bumblebee shippers on varying social platforms such as Tumblr, Twitter, X. It's no longer just Twitter, folks. It's Twitter X. Tumblr, Twitter, X, even Reddit. It's just like, it's rather interesting, and I worded that kindly on purpose. Now, before I go on, I've tried to adjust this, the new tripod to be as straight as possible, so you will have to forgive me until I get a new tripod. I don't know when that will be. Anyway, the biggest criticism on Bumblebee is on the writing and execution, and the reason why this is the case is because some people mentioning that the writing and the execution doesn't seem consistent with what has been said about Bumblebee being planned from the start. Now, the criticism has been misinterpreted by some to be as hate, and if people can't separate genuine criticism, that's actually valid. If you can't separate that from hate, from like it being hateful for no reason, it's like, I really don't know what to say to those who cannot separate that. Now, I will mention here is that there is no known mentioning by the writers if Bumblebee is an endgame pairing. I say this because somebody on Twitter X claims that it is through a particular scene of Volume 8, and the Volume 8 scene in questions where Weiss goes through like a plan pertaining to the relic tied to Atlas. And for the particular scene, you have one side of the scene where Blake and Yang are seated next to each other. Now, another part of the same table, you have Oscar and RWBY seated next to each other. And then another portion of the table, you have Red and Nora. Now, in this particular scene, when Weiss is going through the strategy, is that Weiss and Whitley are standing up, meaning that it could interpret it as a potential split for the Team RWBY. And even in some cases, you could say Team Juniper as well, the surviving members. But that's another video for another day, pertaining to the significance of that scene. Now, pertaining to the fan fiction element of Bumblebee, on archiveofourown.org, that's a fanfiction writing website. It's one of the most popular pairings for the RWBY section of that website, if not the most popular. Now, other criticisms of the ship that have been noted on social media is not tied to the writing or execution, but has been interpreted by some as being it's hateful. Now, some of the criticism could be genuine hate, it could be genuine criticism. And again, it's tied to the main criticism pertaining to the writing and execution. It's like, if you can't separate a genuinely hateful comment about something from it being genuine criticism that the show needs to prove on, I don't know what to say to you. Now, another thing about Bumblebee is that in Volume 7, this is the volume before the whole scene where Weiss strategizes things, is that there's a conversation between Red and Nora about Blake and Yang. Now, we have to remember the scene is where they're at a party for Robin Hill. And Nora's asking about Blake and Yang, and then Red was mentioning one of them doesn't genuinely feel the same way as about the other. Now, we don't know if that's actually the case, because again, these two became canon. But at the same time, there are some hints where it's like that Ren's reply holds weight, holds truth. And I will get to that later on. Now, pertaining to the aftermath of the kiss, the moment where they became canon. Now, there is a moment after the kiss where it's like Yang was mentioning about to Curious Cat in an angry way about something tied to the test that Weiss, Blake, and Yang went through 2 episodes before. Curious Cat's reply was, "You didn't ask." And that whole exchange post-kiss can be interpreted in many ways. It could be at parts of the fan base. Who really knows? Now, pertaining to the sexual orientation for both Yang and Blake, it can be put into question, and there are varying inconsistencies tied to both individually that support this. Now, without any further delay, where is the contradicting and supporting evidence? Once again, you'll have to forgive me pertaining to the orientation of the tripod on my phone, because again, I'm using a new tripod altogether. So without any further delay, I'm going to go into both supporting and contradicting evidence. Now, this is important to know because there is evidence that contradicts the claim where it was been planned from the start. There's also evidence that supports it. So it's one of those, it's like, it comes down to individual interpretation. I'm going to go into the main show and the official companion because this is where a lot of the evidence that goes both ways come into play. Now, there some other evidence, and I'm going to go into it in a little bit, is like outside the show, outside the book. And I will refer to the 2 novels tied to Team Coffee, because I do feel that they both could very well be tied into this video in their own way. Now, the first piece of evidence, and it's contradicting because if you think about the whole phrase has been planned from the start, it would have come up no later than early on in the first season / volume. Now, volume 1, chapter 1, Blake, not Blake, I said Blake, it's Yang, because Blake and Yang don't meet till chapter 3 of the first volume. Now, Yang says about RWBY is going to be the bee's knees, someone special. Now, this is tied to the fact that, granted, at the time this exchange was said, RWBY got into Beacon 2 years ahead of time. So she joins Yang in the sense of going to Beacon. Now, Yang says that RWBY's going to be the bee's knees. Now, the reason why this is interpreted as contradicting, again, it's like Blake and Yang would have had met in the beginning if this were really true. Now, RWBY's response is kind of something to note here, because it's like RWBY's response was, I just want to be a normal girl with normal needs, no one special. I just want to be just like everybody else, seen like everybody else. And, remember that during the test later on, spoiler, Weiss does go with RWBY on this one, in the sense of like, Weiss saves RWBY. RWBY's like, I just wanted you to know I could do this. And Weiss is like, you're fine. And then RWBY was like, normal needs, in the form of normal needs, in the sense of like her prayer being answered. So, the whole thing, this exchange in volume 1, chapter 1, this is contradicting evidence in my opinion. Now, we're going to get into this leak here later. Oh, yes. Now, we're going to go into the first meeting until the whole thing with the teams that had been set up in the first volume. Now, the first meeting for Blake and Yang does not go well. Now, the thing here to note is that Ruby's the one who spots Blake before Yang. And Yang refers to Blake as a lost cause in the end of that first meeting. Now, with Ruby, in the sense of like, you know what, just like, she didn't want to cause any further commotion. Yang's the complete opposite. And then the whole thing with the meeting is that, pertaining to Blake and Yang, it's like, it was after Yang was after Yang was mentioning about the boys in their initiation sleepover. And like, and the sound that she made like right afterwards. Which could put into question of Yang's sexual orientation. Because of an inconsistency like that, and it's a glaring inconsistency. Now, the first piece of supporting evidence comes during the test. Now, this is where, you know, where they're supposed to be seeking out like the person they're paired up with during their time at Beacon. Blake is the one that seeks out Yang. Now, the league, you know, brings up the intentions, all that jazz, so it's like, it's a really who knows at this point, but I do feel that Blake seeking out Yang during the test is a supporting evidence indicator. Now we're going to get to some further contradicting evidence for Blake Belladonna. Now, this right here. Now, the reason why I'm using two different sections of this slide as contradicting evidence because there's a very glaring inconsistency in the official companion. Now, right here, this does bring up Aaron Zetch, who voices Blake, about the harem that Blake has. Now, one member of the harem is Yang. Now, this, again, like I said, this would be seen as supporting evidence if it weren't for the most glaring inconsistency in the same book on a different page. Now, it says here about Blake and Ilya is another member of Blake's harem. Harem. So, what Aaron says about Ilya and Blake is like Ilya, the gay character, pining for her straight friend, which is pretty much Blake. But again, we really don't know if that's really the case. But you're talking about a very glaring inconsistency in the official companion. And this is something that should be noted. Now, some degree of supporting evidence, it's very much like, you know, additional content after volume 1, along with interviews outside the show and even convention appearances. Now, you see this photo here, and that is the Chicago Comic and Entertainment Expo, better known as C2E2. They hold this once a year. The exact dates each year vary. Some of the events were in the summer, some were in the spring, some were in the winter. You get the gist. Now, the voice actors for Jean, Weiss, Blake, and Yang were all at C2E2 2020, which is held on the south side of Chicago. Again, it's once a year, but the one in 2020 was quite early, and it was before the lockdown. And I should know this because I was actually there. Now, what I spotted at the tables for Aaron Zetch and Barbara Dunkelman, apologies if I butchered her surname. Now, but I do recall seeing at their booths a particular photo from volume 6. And the photo is Blake and Yang holding hands, where Yang declares to Adam that she and Yang are protecting each other. And this is before Adam dies in volume 6. So I remember seeing that photo available to be signed by at least one of them, if not both. Now, I will add in this that for the lines for both of them, were not really like were not long. I mean, it's like you could pretty much tell it's kind of like dead. And I did see the line for Miles, who voices Jean. It was pretty consistent. I mean, a few people here and there, but it was like pretty consistent. I think the one for Weiss, Kara Eberly, I think she was the one that was the busiest. I mean, I could be wrong, but I remember, clear as day, that Kara was the one, like, her line was, like, between the four of them, her line was probably the busiest of the four. But I did see the whole thing with Blake and Yang, that photo at their booths. And the only reason why I didn't go after it is because it's like, I'm one of those people when it comes to like autographs for like varying characters, I want them individually, not like as a group, unless it's like a fan version of that. If that makes any sense. So that bit out of the way. Now there was an interview prior to the airing of Volume 6 where Aaron Zedge, Blake's VA, mentioned the harem, which of course, if I could get this to do it right, is in the companion. So this is one of the things that completely supports the companion. That one instance. But you have to remember, the companion is more or less a contradicting evidence, and I will explain why later on. Now, on to late Volume 8. Now, you have to remember, late Volume 8, Blake was only concerned about Yang, and this was clearly evident in the, I want to say it's chapter 13, where Yang's the first one to go into Ever After. And Blake was like, Yang! It's like, Weiss had a reminder there are other people that need to reach safety, but Blake's only concern for Yang does hint at some degree of selfishness. Now, I'm going to get into certain things about the hugs later on, so that's that on that. So I'm going to go into that third point. So the whole thing with Blake's selfishness, like in the sense of her being only concerned for Yang, this kind of brings me back to Volume 6, Chapter 2. Now, I kind of bring this up because some people, I mentioned this on Twitter X recently, and I was like, oh, she never said that. And it's like, but you have to remember the scene in Volume 6, Chapter 2, where Blake suggests Weiss going to Alice by herself. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because Yang, Yang was blindly agreeing with it for money reasons. And the whole thing with Blake, suggesting Weiss without even thinking, is she still the heiress? We know that in Volume 4, that Weiss is no longer the heiress. So it's one of those things where it's the first hint of assuming things and not really asking questions. And I think that some people may see that whole thing in Volume 6, Chapter 2 is like, is Blake wanting to split up the team so she could be with Yang? Now, I do want to point out that a potential piece of contradicting evidence comes in the intro to Volume 6 at the very end. Because if you see at the very end, it's like Ruby and Weiss are there, like, getting up together. But at the end, you see Blake and Yang on opposite sides. And this kind of is supported in a sense of, if you look at the start of that intro to Volume 6, it's like Ruby, Blake, Yang, to Weiss, and then you see it in Volume 9. The whole thing is like, it's not in the order. It's like, for Volume 9, it's Weiss, Blake, Yang, and Ruby, and their facial expressions are like different from before. Now, the reason why I mentioned Blake's intentions, and this is for supporting evidence, is like similar in the sense of how Raven's actions split up Team Stark. Now, this particular action with Raven is revealed in Volume 4 via the conversation between Tai, Yang, and Yang. So, that's that part of that. Now, in late Volume 6, this is before Adam's death. Adam asks Blake about what she sees in Yang. Blake doesn't really give a response. Now, here it's where Adam hinted at, about like her being like this a similar way to Adam back in the day, hinting at some degree of dishonesty from Blake. Now, this whole interaction in Volume 6 can be interpreted in multiple ways and pointed out somewhat later on in Volume 8. Now, speaking of late Volume 8, now when she returns to the team, she gives 3 different types of hugs to the remaining members. And it does hint, a potential split, because the hug between Yang and Weiss doesn't seem as sincere as the other two. And I do feel that there are unresolved tensions between Yang and Weiss, and I'll address that later on. Now, for Volume 9, and this is Chapter 2, is that Weiss teased to RWBY is that she quotes like it's about time, with the whole thing with the hand, playing with the hand holding, all that stuff. So we see, Weiss kind of teases RWBY about that. And we do see this as supporting evidence, because Weiss is getting clear support of those two. Now, the RWBY Justice League crossover films, I do recall seeing a snippet of one on Twitter X, where Blake, does a hip bump with Blake. So I do see that as been supporting evidence. Now, when it comes down to the Bumblebee blessing, Weiss clearly gives Yang her blessing for Yang and Blake to be together in Volume 5, Chapter 8. So that's about as much on that as I could do. And like I said, I just don't want to go into everything, every aspect of the show, all that stuff, because it's like, I'm just going to be wasting my time. Now, right here, now this is a couple of moments in Volume 7 where I feel this has both supporting and contradicting evidence. Now, in Volume 7, there's a couple of particular key spots here. Now, one of them is the selfie Yang has with Blake. And this is along with something a little bit later on in Volume 7, the party for Robin Hill. Now, the party for Robin Hill, you have some of the main characters like Penny, Ruby, Ren, and Nora. So those characters I'll be referring to, in that particular part, in that particular portion. Bleh. So anyway, we're gonna go into certain things in this particular aspect of the evidence. Now, when it comes down to the smile from Blake, it appears to be a little forced. Meaning that, if you really think about it, it's like, she's not, it's like, what has to really think about? Is she really photogenic? Does she really want to have her picture taken? So the selfie, I do feel was a little bit forced, and I'll explain why later on. Now, before the selfie, I want to say this was after the mission with Aesop's. I want to say somebody on Team RWBY, I think it was either Blake and or Yang, were mentioning that they forgot about the Huntsman licensing when they were getting their licenses. Now the reason why I mentioned, this is supporting evidence is because it's like with the whole thing with Blake and Yang, being on the lookout for each other way more than anything else. It's like, it's very natural for them to forget about the licensing. Now, another part with the whole celebration. Now, RWBY is away from everybody. And, she's only talking to Crow about getting information about Summer, the differences about RWBY's approach versus Summer's approach. And it's just like, she's not really into, being around anybody. And it's like, and this is a potential hint of, everybody being on their own agenda. And this could split the Team RWBY up completely. If that were the case. Now, to reiterate the whole thing with Nora and Ren, this is the party for Robin Hill. Now, Nora and Ren talk about the whole thing with Blake and Yang because I think she's noticing, they're getting a little too close, and some people will word it that way. They're getting cozy, all that stuff. So Nora's all, are they? Aren't they? And then Ren's response is like, one doesn't really feel the same way. Now, this could be seen as very much contradicting because it's like, again, it kind of comes up to, is it one-sided? Is it really planned? Will they last? So on and so forth. And you can clearly see that Yang and Blake are being on their own agenda of sorts. And then the whole thing with other characters, this could prove that Blake might not be as honest with her feelings as we thought. Proving one Adam Taurus correct. But it remains to be seen, and that's mainly because there's no Volume 10 and beyond to really clarify this. Now, some surprising, contradicting evidence, I do feel, and I was thinking about this for a little while, comes down to the whole thing between Ruby and Blake. Because if you think about the whole aspect of Volume 9, Chapter 7, before Ruby storms off, I think if you look at Blake's expressions, all that stuff, it's like Blake may be thinking that in a sense of whether or not Ruby has feelings for her as well, which makes things a little bit more interesting for Blake's harem. So something I was thinking about for a little while, but I just want to bring that up. I do think that Ruby may secretly have feelings for Blake, and it's something I'm not so sure if Yang's picking up on it, but I do think, I don't know if Yang's picking up on the whole aspect with Ruby potentially having feelings for Blake, but I do think Blake's the one that's starting to catch on a little bit. Now we're going to get into varying Volume 9 highlights. Now I'm going to zoom in here. I'm going to use the tripod to do this manually, so that way I don't really screw up the orientation for this video. Now, someone mentioned on Twitter X that, and I'm going to get this as close as I can, is that they mentioned about the whole thing being awkward and uncomfortable. Then the whole thing with the I love you too, that exchange, is that Yang was all good on her end, but Blake's was a little on the rushed side. And it sounded a little insincere, which could very well hint of the one-sided Bumblebee. Now, pertaining to the viewership for Volume 9 as a whole, I do think that Chapter 6, where they became official, does support and contradict things in sense of the viewership being at its peak. Meaning that when people only watch it for certain things, it kind of helps the ship, but it also hurts the ship because it's yeah, that's what we want to see, but we don't want to see anything else but. Meaning that this hurts the show in the long run, in my opinion. But I'll get into that later. Now, again, in Chapter 2 of Volume 9, to reiterate, she does support Bumblebee in her exchange with Ruby. Now, pertaining to the whole aftermath of what happened to Ruby in Volume 9, Chapter 8, now, Weiss had, and this is kind of one of those instances where it's another character that may not be directly tied to Bumblebee, but it will affect them through other means. Now, if you remember, for the whole thing with after what happened to Ruby in Volume 9, Chapter 8, Weiss has no one to support her. Blake and Yang have each other to support. And then with Jean, he has his entire team. Now, I did mention that there is a possibility that RWBY could very well be jealous. And the fact that Weiss not having anyone to really support her, this could affect RWBY due to the lack of support Weiss has. Now, this lack of support Weiss has does stem from Volume 6, Chapter 2. Because if you think about the whole exchange about Blake saying, hey, let's just go have Weiss go into Atlas by herself. Yang was the one who blindly agreed with Blake for monetary reasons. RWBY, however, was the only one who really understood Weiss's concerns about that plan. And the fact that the hint of being on a different agenda doesn't really sit well. And then if you notice that with Yang and Weiss, they're a bit more civil. And due to the whole thing, Weiss being the way she is, it affects RWBY, and it's a bit of a domino effect. Meaning that RWBY could very well confront Yang and saying, hey, why you Weiss being more civil than the rest? There could be something else going on. And then the whole jealousy thing with Yang and Weiss being more civil, it becomes a major catalyst for RWBY. And it affects the sisterly relationship between RWBY and Yang, and it forces a breakup between Blake and Yang. Now, in the later volumes, Yang's being more concerned about Blake doing her own thing, have her own little agenda. The fact that she's ignoring family over her girlfriend, it's like indicator of selfishness and repeating Raven's mistakes. And this could show Yang's true colors, which could split up Team RWBY, just like how Raven split up Team Stark. And I say this because if you remember Volume 9, Chapter 1, Yang was telling RWBY, you're not supposed to be here. But I think Yang doesn't realize that RWBY has to be there with the team. It's not fair for, her not to be a part of resolving the problems. Now, we're going to get into this right here. Let me pause this for a moment. Okay, so I was thinking about it for a while. I'm just going to say screw it. I'm just going to go with it for the remainder of this video. So we're going to go into certain aspects about the shippers. Now, the Bumblebee shippers, it's like there's a good chunk, they are like civil friendly, all that stuff. But there's also another number of them where it's like they're not. It's like they're very like gung ho, like making sure everybody ships Bumblebee. If they're not, you're homophobic. Blah blah blah. Now, I'm not gonna reveal if I think they're hurting or helping. But let's go over what I've seen. And this is from Reddit. Now this is from years ago, so. This is kind of old news, but it's worth reiterating. Now, when it comes down to the Bumblebee shipping, Aaron's a bigger fan of the ship than Barbara Dunkelman at that time when this was written. I do feel this has changed over time. Now, they mentioned here the varying rare pairings. So this is pause it, take a screenshot to help out. Now, this is, I believe, about the song Bumblebee. And this is a Volume 4 soundtrack of song. Now, there's a whole lot with this particular song on its own where it sparked its own controversy, where it's like people were being targeted because it was revealed when it was released, not Volume 9, but around Volume 4 when the song was released, that Yang and Blake were not canon at that time when the song came out. Now, it was a lot of things happened since that song came out. Things had to be cleared up, and things just really hit the fan. Now, this is some of the other instances of stuff from the shippers, and by that, some of the Bumblebee shippers and the people who are criticizing the writing and the execution. Now, some people mention, it wasn't her fault, she didn't abandon her, blah, 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 blah. Now, that's the smaller writing. Now, the bigger writing is oh, really, to tell me why she defended Blake from RWBY when she had enough of RWBY drinking the tea in front of her, and she did nothing. Stop defending Yang. She cared about Blake more than RWBY. Now, there is evidence from Volume 7, possibly late Volume 6, that does support the bigger writing. And which I have to mention before, meaning that Blake and Yang go clubbing, that being the big one. Now, this is some of the stuff that one of the Bumblebee shippers said to somebody else. And we're just going to enjoy a bit of the fireworks. And this is what I was talking about. Some of the Bumblebee shippers, not all Bumblebee shippers, but some of them have called those who do not ship Bumblebee as homophobic. Now, again, people who do this labeling without realizing need to know that Blake and Yang are not the only female-female pairing in RWBY, regardless if it's canon or not. Now, some people may see this as harassment, and this is the same person from the last couple of slides. And before I go on, I have blocked the usernames, all that stuff, because I just don't want people's identities to be revealed. Now, another one saying is like, hey, just say you're homophobic. Again, people need to realize that that Blake and Yang are not the only women pairing in RWBY. Because again, there's Blake and Weiss, Blake and RWBY, Weiss and Yang, Weiss and RWBY, even Nora and Yang, Nora and Weiss, Ilya Weiss, so on and so forth. And now, this is one of those things where it gets really interesting in the sense of like, whether or not it's planned or not. Now, people have interpreted this kind of wily in the sense of like a million different directions. Now, it's mentioned here, and I'm going to get this close so you guys can see it. Now, it says here that before the show even aired, there was a live stream between the cast, and Aaron asked, can I tell them that we're lesbian lovers? Monty said no, and this is when they had to realize the stream had already started. So there was a live stream, and then, yeah. Now, this particular aspect is like, you can interpret this in a plethora of ways. Now, the next two slides, let me see if I can get it here. Now, this is like people who have previously animated for RWBY. They're mentioning some decision making, which were like in defense of because like money, budget, decision making, so on and so forth. Which I'm going to call BS. Because it's like, you really can't be defending bad decisions. You don't want to reward bad behavior. Now, this is what I think about the some of the Bumblebee shippers. Yes, they are hurting the community. Now, again, the whole thing with Twitter X, Reddit, Tumblr, I'll get to the whole thing with Tumblr later on, is that I think it shows that some people are afraid to ask questions before assuming things. Because if you assume things before asking, it makes everybody look like an absolute idiot. And it also shows that the lack of acknowledgement that there are other female pairings the show has. Again, Blake and Weiss, Blake and RWBY, Weiss and Yang, RWBY and Weiss, Nora and Yang, Nora and Weiss, Ilya Weiss, etc. Regardless if it's Tumblr or whatever source have you. Now, Twitter X, Tumblr, Reddit, those are probably three of the biggest ones where the accusations have piled up in the sense of like accusing of whatever. Now, pertaining to the last RWBY Rewind video on YouTube, I'm going to try to have that video in the description below. But there was a particular comment string. It was somebody who was impersonating Miles Luna pertaining to the status of Bumblebee, where it was like, oh, they're going to become canon and there's going to be intimate scenes. Now, the reason why it's somebody impersonating it because those comments were eventually removed. Even Miles Luna took to Twitter, which is now Twitter X, saying that it's like he was kind of appalled because the impersonator, or imposter I should say, was saying things that he himself would not say. Now, when it comes to the actual kiss of Volume 9, Chapter 6, some people may see that was a little intimate. Which kind of questions is like, was it really an imposter or not? Now, the whole thing with the previous animators, again, that's hurting like the community because it's like, again, you're defending bad behavior. And that really should not be happening. Now, we're going to go into the whole thing with pansexuality because there were some, like, he said, she said about Yang being pansexual. Now, pansexual is pretty much somebody attracted to anybody regardless of gender or gender identity. Now, I actually know somebody in real life who is pansexual. And there's also another individual I work with who I think identifies as pansexual. So I interviewed the one I know for sure is pansexual. And this is what she told me. Her name is Jess. She does some pretty cool work. I do want to mention she is moving out of Illinois come January. I believe she's going back to Puerto Rico. I wish you all the best. So I asked her a few questions so that way we can understand pansexuality together. Now, when it comes down to the whole thing about monogamy versus polygamy, yes, as a pansexual, you can be monogamous. However, there are some who identify as pansexual will have open relationships with others. But you can be monogamous. You can have just one person. Now, with that being said, not everybody will be supportive of the lifestyle. And this could be hinted, with the whole thing with RWBY and her tirade in Volume 9, Chapter 7 towards the very end. Now, when it comes to those who are in a relationship with a pansexual, communication on all aspects of the relationship is an absolute must and the top priority. Now, the reason again I want to bring up pansexuality because again, somebody mentioned this about Yang, and there is a possibility of her being pansexual due to the whole aspect from Volume 1, Chapter 3, before meeting Blake. Now, pertaining to the Rewrite Volume 10 update, so on and so forth, how all this affects Bumblebee. Now, when it comes down to the script for Volume 10, that's the only thing we know about the whole aspect at the moment. We do have the Volume 10 script in progress at the most recent RTX. Again, that's a Comic-Con-like event in Texas. Now, we do know, in addition to that, there is a lack of an animation department for Rooster Teeth, meaning that this is going to be one of the things that they will have to prioritize on in order for Volume 10 to be on the air at all in any way. Now, when it comes down to the crossover film series for RWBY and Justice League, it's from Warner Brothers, who owns Rooster Teeth, meaning that they can have a bigger say in this than we think. And this could also mean that we could very well see a completely different animation team for RWBY, if we see something like that going forward for Volume 10. Now, more information about the most recent RTX event. There was a call by the writers to greenlight Volume 10. There is a hashtag movement for this on Twitter X. But like I said, it's not been confirmed yet. Now, somebody mentioned on Reddit that the viewership for Volume 9 on the Crunchyroll website isn't anywhere near the numbers for some of the other programs that are already there. Meaning that it was like in the single thousands, but not like tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. It doesn't have the numbers that people would come to expect. Now, speaking of Crunchyroll, that website, there are reviews on RWBY from 2013, and I feel this is a bit of a move that's disingenuous because you're talking about the partnership pertaining to RWBY and by RWBY, Rooster Teeth and Crunchyroll was well past 2013 and more recent, meaning that it could be fabricated for all I know. But that's just my opinion on that in brief. Now, if we do see a rewrite, and I'm going to get into some potential hints on that in a little bit, this could affect Bumblebee in a variety of ways. Could be good, could be bad, we don't know. Now, the way the rewrite could be good is that everything's a lot more consistent in the sense of development, meaning that the hits are more present, consistent, and there's plenty of it. Now, it could be bad if the rewrite is the same copy pasta we've seen up to Volume 9, Chapter 10. And the writing and the execution reflects that. So, as of right now, a lack of Volume 10 and beyond is leaving Bumblebee open-ended, meaning that it has room to break them up. Now, another possibility here is that the rewrite for, I wouldn't say a rewrite, but the continuation of RWBY for Volume 10 and beyond could be done as novels. Meaning that, if you remember, there are 2 novels already for RWBY in the sense of for Team Coffee. And I know the first Team Coffee novel does have a scene in it via a flashback where Yang thought of Weiss as an elitist, which is something to note, and I'll reveal a little bit more on that part later on. And then we do know in the second Team Coffee novel, so we do see Velvet and Sun hanging out. We don't know the extent of that relationship, but it could very well affect the whole thing between Blake and Yang in their own way, should Sun reunite with Blake in the future. And I feel that the novels might be the way to go if the whole animation team aspect is not resolved, along with no Volume 10. Now, the strikes for SAG after the Screen Actors Guild, that's been recently resolved in a sense, but it's not completely done yet. So there's a strike that recently got resolved. So we could see a delay of Volume 10 if it gets confirmed to maybe 2025. That's the soonest I could see it. Maybe 2026. And this is and the SAG after a strike was in the footsteps of the writers part of that same guild. And another thing I do want to point out, actually, you know what? Scratch that. I was thinking about it for a little while. Oh, actually, now I remember. Now, there has been some speculation pertaining to Aaron Zetch, Blake's voice actress. So I was reading a little bit. I do not know if it's true, so do not quote me. As to whether or not she was going to get replaced for her role as Blake, because there's some speculation of her contract, and that she was made to sign it, so that she wouldn't get replaced. So I do not know if there's any truth to that. I'm just going to leave it as a rumor because it's there's no multiple number of sources that confirms it. So I'm just going to leave it as a rumor. Now we're going to get into the leaks. Now, I'm going to go into the leak on the right here first. So I'm just going to get this tripod here a little bit. So we're going to get over here real quick. Now, we're going to get into this one right here because this pertains to Volume 9. And it says here, John ascends, Curious Cat gets out of Neo and gets killed. And we see RWBY and Jean evacuate. So this is one of the leaks right here. Now, that's down there. Now, we're going to go into Blake here more so because this is a little bit more important. Now, if you look here, this is a little bit more evidence, supposedly, that Bumblebee was not really planned until around Volume 4. So, again, this kind of contradicts the whole thing from the beginning. If they don't know what the beginning really means. Now, the first 3 is she's morally ambiguous. Background we know nothing about. Loyalties tested. Conflict, all that stuff. And this is where the whole thing with the whole love aspect. And mentions, in the leak here, mentions that Yang only wins because everyone else is written out or dead. Which is true because Sun was written out, Ilya was written out, Adam is dead. So I do feel that the leaks were proven to be mostly correct. I'll get into my reason why a little bit later. Now this is more on the leaks. So they also mentioned, that they don't really mention the whole thing with Penny. They don't acknowledge the flaws, the whole thing with Pyrrha, so on and so forth. And I'm just keeping this brief. Now, we're going to get into my thoughts on the leaks. Now, as I said before, everything that was leaked prior, I don't want to say everything, but the majority of what was leaked prior to Volume 9, Chapter 10, the majority of it, not all of it, proved to be correct. Now, one of the leaks has suggested that it was not until around Volume 4, in the sense of planning Bumblebee. So it really wasn't planned, so those on the show that say. So again, it's a bit of a he said, she said. Volume 1 does contradict the whole claim about planning from the start. So we do know that LGBT plus characters were planned, but it was kept vague by some as to who and the when. Meaning that things were kept vague for a reason. Now, another thing about the leaks where it's like, Blake was supposed to have more time with John, which could be like proving that Blake's not as honest about her feelings for Yang as we thought. And Sun would have pointed that particular aspect out, like via Volume 6, Chapter 1. Now pertaining to the leaks down there, they're mentioning about the major financial issues, which is what resulted in how we saw Volume 9 turning out to be. Now, the reason why I said this is like, a lot of things were cut, things were like removed. You get the drill. But as I said, it's mostly correct, in my personal opinion. Now, that right there, again, this is like the whole thing, we do know that there were plenty of LGBT plus characters. We simply did not know exactly who or the when, because it was kept vague on purpose. Now, I do want to mention here is that when they were asking, okay, can we come out as lovers, lesbian lovers? It's like, I think you say here, Monty said no. Carrie was like, no, not yet. And I think Miles said no, but it's like, we honestly don't really know, like, who truly said what. And we may never know. Now, the whole thing with the one-sided nature, will it last? Making things open-ended, da-da-da-da-da. Now, the whole thing with the potential of Bumblebee being one-sided, again, Sun and RWBY will become the major catalyst if that does become the case. Now, since the last RTX, no new info on Volume 10. This could leave Bumblebee open-ended, meaning that fanfiction writers can have a field day on this, meaning that they can break Blake and Yang up. And then the whole thing with the jealousy from RWBY, that could be one reason why they break up. Again, this is just like observation of that. Effect, and in addition to that, you don't have word from the writers indicating of an endgame pairing of Bumblebee, which means it leaves the door wide open at this time for them to break up in the future. Now, when it comes down to the whole aspect of Volume 7, in the sense of like, who's not genuine with their feelings for the other, is leaning towards Blake at the moment, but there are some possibilities that it could be Yang. But my personal opinion here is that when it comes to the whole one-sided aspect, I think it's Blake. And the whole thing with RWBY being jealous, Sun being another major catalyst, Weiss being a reason, I do see this being Blake. Now, the unresolved tensions tied to Yang and Weiss, this could be a surprising role because, again, this affects RWBY and the sisterly relationship between RWBY and Yang. Now, another thing people don't really pay attention to is the ending of Goldilocks. Now, it's a fairy tale character which Yang Xiaolong is based off. The ending of Goldilocks is as follows. Goldilocks gets discovered. She disappears, never to return. Meaning that if the writers were thinking about that instead of breaking them up, they could do the Goldilocks anywhere. At some point, Blake and Yang break up, and they become friends again, but they don't return to being lovers again. But, again, I'm just going off of the ending of Goldilocks. Now, we're going to get into this a little bit later. Let me see if I can find it. Now, we're going to go into my experience with a couple of Bumblebee shippers. And it's not a good story. This may have some people having their hearts broken. So, it was around early, I know it was 2019, and I had Tumblr at the time. So, basically, it's just like I was expressing support of Freezer which is a romantic pairing of Weiss and Yang, which is like a lesbian pairing, much like Blake and Yang. Now, it was a post on Tumblr on RWBY. Now, a couple of people were labeling me as homophobic. Now, in the post, I remember it mentioning that they were saying that anyone who ships Weiss and Yang are lesophobic. And that's a phobia of lesbians. So that's pretty much what happened. So I was labeled as homophobic for supporting Freezer. And I was mentioning about the writing and execution. I don't care who people ship. But they were like, they didn't care. Now, one of the two shippers also gave me some ageist slur. Meaning that slur and ageism is like basically someone who's not on silver terms with those that are older than them. So it was somebody that's about in their mid-20s at this moment in time. At the moment when this happened, they were 20 years old. So they're 24 right now. So, yeah. So I was given some ageist slur. And it caused a pretty bad anxiety attack because you think about social media. You know how people tend to report certain things to employers, going after somebody's job. So that was the trigger of my anxiety attack. It was bad. I was afraid I was going to lose my job. And I had to get off of Tumblr completely almost after the fact. I actually had to call somebody who, the person has since left my job. So, yeah, so I had to call them. I explained to them what happened. And just like that person like really calmed me down. So I thank them wholeheartedly for like being able to talk to me over the phone over this matter. So, yeah, I had a really bad anxiety attack. I had to get off of Tumblr completely. And the thing is, I'm as pro-LGBT plus as they come in real life. So for me, as I was pointing out the execution and the writing, which is valid criticism. And it seems like those two doesn't seem to understand that at the time that when it comes to inconsistent execution, inconsistent writing, that is valid criticism. You really should not construe that as hate. So ever since this episode on Tumblr, again, I'm not even on Tumblr at all anymore. I keep who I ship to myself, and I also don't ship anybody on RWBY anymore. And when it comes to interaction with the RWBY community, is as minimum as possible, because it's like I need to keep myself safe above everything. Now, we're going to go into the Bumblebee planning, Is it as planned as claimed? No. That's the short version of my answer. It's not planned from the start. Now, when it comes to the writing and the execution of the ship, it's among the worst in my personal opinion. Then when it comes to the fanfiction of writing a Bumblebee, it's done a lot better. And for some of the people on RWBY to use fan fiction to help write Volume 9, it's like, I don't feel it's original. It's not real in my eyes. If it really was planned from the start, it should have been early on Volume 1, the latest. Now, another thing to point out, and I forgot to mention this earlier in the video, is that Blake was suspicious of Yang in Volume 3, post the one-on-one fight between Yang and Mercury. Now, the leaks mentioning the Bumblebee planning turned out to be correct because, again, you have certain things actually happening in the show. Adam gets killed off. Sun and Ilya are written off. Now, the whole thing with the official companion, the book, this is where the biggest amount of contradiction is, in the sense of like, yeah, it's something you can actually look up easily, if not one of them, because you have one thing on a character and a group of other characters, then you have another section. It's like just one other character. And if I were the people behind the official companion, they should spot this and make some type of clarification ahead of time. They chose not to, which is why I feel is among the most contradicting aspects of evidence for this ship. Final thoughts. Now, before and since they became canon, I do not think Bumblebee is a ship that reads the room as well as they claim, because there has been some he said, she said on Twitter ads where it's like, people who support Bumblebee as a ship did not want it to become canon. And that should have been like, keep it as a ship, don't make it become canon. Because if there are some people who say, hey, it's good as a ship, but don't make it canon, and you ignore that, it's like you're doing this for selfish reasons. Now, regarding the writing and the execution, it would have been more believable if it were consistent from the start, instead of the writing and execution. Now, decision-making for the show has affected varying aspects of the ship, which includes the leaks, interviews, so on and so forth. When it comes to the toxic shippers, regardless if it's Bumblebee or not, you gotta call it out for the toxicity. Because if you don't call it out, you're as part of the problem as the ones who are doing it themselves. Because there's no new info on Volume 10 since the last RTX, and no word from writers about Bumblebee remaining canon afterwards, right now it's currently open-ended, meaning that there's room for them to break up for any reason. Now, the whole thing to keep in mind is Goldilocks. That's the character Yang is based off of. You got to keep the ending to Goldilocks in mind, because they could probably put that as like the means to break Yang and Blake up if they so choose. Now, the whole thing with Adam is like, again, Volume 6, this can put Blake's sincerity into question about varying things, including Yang. Now, once again, Sun and RWBY become major catalysts if push comes to shove. Now, varying aspects of Volume 7, this could be another thing that could break Yang and Blake up. Who really knows at this point? Now, in the end here, I will mention a few things in sense of the actual final thoughts. Is that when it comes to the writers for RWBY, it's just like they really need to know how to make things consistent. Because without the consistency that varying other shows are known for, it's like no one's going to believe you. People are taking the information about Bumblebee with a grain of salt. And that is just heartbreaking in itself. And as much as I would like to continue on with this video, unfortunately that's not the case right now. So I am going to end it with this. To the shippers, call out the toxicity. Because if you don't, you are just as much of the problem as the toxic shippers themselves. You can make a difference to make the community better and safer. And that is all I have for this video. With Wolvie here signing off, I will catch you all on the flip side.